video, I'm gonna show you my well-tested recipe for carnitas, which is basically meltingly tender pork that's been crisped up in its own fat and served in a taco. My recipe pays tribute to the authentic Mexican version, but I've made a few fundamental changes to the process that not only improve the final result, but also help make this dish much more accessible for the home kitchen. To get started, I'm gonna grab 5 pounds of nice tasting pork shoulder. And when I say nice tasting pork, I just mean pork that has plenty of intramuscular marbling like this, and preferably is produced outside of the standard issue commodity pork industry in America. That pork, aside from it being produced in a way that should bum most humans out, it's just not a very good product. It's very wet, it doesn't have a lot of fat, and the fat that it does have is not particularly well marbled. It has this kind of barnyardy smell and taste, and it's a B-tier product at best. The 3 places I would go to get good tasting pork would be a farmer's market, because the person selling it to you probably raised it holistically, and that probably means that it's gonna taste pretty good. A local butcher, assuming they sell high quality pork, or actually Whole Foods. They have some sort of standards when it comes to meat, and the stuff that's in the case is not the same stuff that's at most grocery stores, and it just tastes better. Now to prep this pork shoulder, I'm just gonna cut it down into roughly 2 to 3 inch sized cubes. And the pork sizes don't need to be totally perfect here. We're just trying to chunk it down into pieces that are gonna be shreddable later on. And if you're wondering why I'm not just cooking this whole, like wouldn't that be easier? Well, something just happens when you cook this in chunks where the spaces in between the meat get filled with fat and pork juice, and it kind of just stews in that. When you've got a whole shoulder, there's a lot of empty volume, and it just ends up sitting low in the pot, and the meat is almost roasting, which is a totally different style of cooking. And it just gives us a result that's different than what we want. Once I've got my pork cut into 2 to 3 inch cubes, I'm just gonna move it over to a medium-sized bowl real quick. Then I'm going to add in 50 grams of salt. Then I'm gonna add in 2 grams of dried oregano, 10 grams of onion powder, and then I'm gonna, whoopsie doopsie, and then I'm gonna press in 30 grams of garlic, which is about 7 to 8 cloves. By the way, this is the final version of the Lagerstrom Home Goods garlic press, and it's going on sale in about 1 to 2 weeks from now, or when this video comes out. And if you wanna know about it when it launches, I'll throw a link in the description. You can sign up for our mailing list, and we'll let you know. Once everything's in the bowl, I'm just gonna jump in and toss to get everything evenly coated. And if you're thinking that seems like a pretty gratuitous amount of salt, it's a high number, I'll admit that. But you gotta keep in mind that these are big chunks of meat, and it takes quite a bit of salt to make them taste seasoned. And most of the salt that's in this bowl is not gonna make it to the final taco. Some of it's gonna be coming off in the cooking process and resting in the final roasting juices. So to get the right perception of seasoning in the final taco, I think you need to start with a pretty big number, which in this case is about 2 to 2.2%, which is pretty standard when you're roasting big pieces of meat. Okay, once everything's tossed to combine like this, I'm gonna move this bowl over to the fridge to sit for 1 hour. Of course, a lot of people out there are wondering, hey Bri, I'm short on time. Can I throw this in the oven right away? Sure, you certainly can do that. You just gotta know that there's going to be a pretty decent drop in quality, because as soon as that pork warms up, that salt is gonna get dissolved and it's gonna melt into the bottom of the pot. This gives you blander meat and saltier cooking liquid. Allowing the pork to sit in the fridge for an hour allows that salt to stabilize so that when you go to roast it, the meat is much more evenly seasoned and it doesn't just melt and fall into the bottom of the pot. Okay, so we're gonna check back in 1 hour. 1 hour later, when I pull this pork out of the fridge, it's looking nicely cured. And I can tell that mainly because the meat isn't looking wet anymore, and I can no longer see individual grains of salt. So to me, that just means that the salt was dissolved and then that brine was reabsorbed into the meat. So now it's stabilized, and when we go to cook it, the meat's gonna be evenly seasoned. Speaking of cooking, I'm gonna set this aside and then grab a large, heavy bottom pot, which for me specifically is a 6.75 quart Dutch oven. If you're in the market for a heavy bottom pot, I think this form factor is just about as good as it gets. It's particularly good for braises and slow roasted dishes like the carnitas that we're about to make. Okay, from here, I'm going to snuggle up these chunks of cured pork into the bottom of the pot. And I'm just trying to get these laid in here with as little space in between them as possible, so that as they cook, they release their pork fat, and then the pork fat fills all those spaces, and then the pork starts to kind of confit in its own fat. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard the phrase confit before, but you might not know what it means. And it's basically just this French technique where you cure meat and then cook it in its own fat. Traditionally, this is done with duck legs for duck confit, and it gives you a very melty, unctuous, super tender result that's really well seasoned because the meat is cured ahead of time. Now, actually confiting this, meaning cooking it at 100% fat, is maybe traditional, and that's how a lot of carnitas would be made in Mexico by someone's abuela, but it's just not practical for the home cook, mainly because you have to go out and find a bunch of pork lard. To cook this much pork, we would need a quart or two of rendered pork lard, and not only would that be expensive, I don't even really know where to tell you to go get it, aside from like a Mexican market where you could get like manteca or something like that, but it's not practical. So what we're doing here is kind of a hybrid technique where we're going to be braising and confitting. It's gonna be roughly equal parts flavorful pork liquid and pork fat. So to do that sort of hybrid method, I'm gonna add in 100 grams of chicken stock or water. What this is gonna do is provide some wet heat that gets the pork cooking quickly so that it starts rendering out its pork fat so we can start cooking it in pork fat sooner than later. So basically we're confitting it in its own rendered fat here instead of adding exogenous pork lard that we bought from a store. Now to season this up, I'm gonna add in 1 cinnamon stick, which is just enough to bring a little bit of that aroma and a bit of that warm spice without overwhelming the entire dish. Then I'm gonna add in 4 to 5 bay leaves. Then I'm gonna take 1 whole orange that I've quartered and I'm gonna squeeze out the juice to bring a little bit of acidity, a little bit of sweetness, and that orange oil aroma. And then I'll just squeeze the other 2 in here and drop those in. And I'm gonna cook them along with the pork so that the peel releases all of its orange oil and orange essence into this pork as it cooks. Okay, once everything's in the pot, I'm gonna pop on my lid and then move this over to a preheated 250F oven to cook for 3 hours in total, but I'm gonna check back halfway just to see how it's progressing and to flip over the meat to make sure everything is getting cooked evenly. Now, 250 seems really, really low and 3 hours seems like a long time, but carnitas, in my opinion, are all about the unctuous, melty quality. And so the slower we get to that point, the better. Surely you could make this meat tender and fall apart in about 90 minutes if you were to cook it at 350 or 325F, but you would be squeezing out so much of the moisture and you would be cooking it so aggressively that by the time you sear it and get it crispy, it'll be really frickin' dry. If we wanna have unctuous, melty, fatty pork sitting on the tortilla, in my opinion, you have to cook it extremely slowly. Keep in mind, we're doing a little bit of that hybrid maneuver where we have some wetness, so it's almost like braising, and some fat, so it's almost like confitting. 250 for me is the best of both worlds there, and it does take a while, but it's super worth it. So we'll check back in 90. And at the 90-minute mark or so, I'm gonna come back and rip the Dutchie out of the oven. Ooh, not a ton has happened, if I'm being totally honest. The pork has released some of its juices, things are starting to get cooked, but to go from fridge temperature to the point where the pork is actually getting tender takes a little while, and we're just entering into that sweet spot now. So from here, I'm just gonna flip the pork over, just because the stuff that's sitting in the rendered pork fat and the pork drippings cooks a little bit faster than the stuff that's facing upwards. And we just wanna make sure everything is cooked as evenly as possible. In the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, a lot of pork fat's gonna come out of this. And by the time I pull this out at 3 hours, you're gonna see it's gonna be basically swimming in fat and pork drippings. So once everything's flipped, I'm just gonna make sure that it's snugged into the liquid as much as possible. Then I will pop the lid back on, set a timer for 90 more minutes, then throw it into the oven and finish cooking. While that roasts, I quickly want to thank Helix for sponsoring this vid. Being a grown-up is generally pretty sick, but one of the worst parts of it is mattress shopping for sure. It's time-consuming, it's exhausting, it's confusing because all of the mattress stores have somehow colluded to make comparing their products very hard or basically impossible, and then you leave the store having spent $2,000 not knowing if what you bought was actually good or if you actually liked it. So that's why last year when Lauren and I decided that we needed to buy a second mattress for our house, we basically went back to Helix. And when I say went back to Helix, let me just clarify. They sent us a free mattress like 4.5 years ago, and we loved it so much that when we needed another, we basically used our own money to buy the exact same thing, which is the Helix Dawn Luxe. This is a super sick mattress that is quite firm for people who like that, but it's not rock hard by any means. It actually has a little bit of a softness on the top, and it's really good for people who sleep on their back. The thing about Helix that I really like is that you don't need to know anything about mattresses to get the right one. You just take a quick online sleep quiz by telling them about your body type and your sleep preferences, and then they match you with the mattress that matches your preferences. Helix also gives you free shipping in the US, a 100-night sleep trial, and a limited lifetime warranty, so you have plenty of time to make sure that this mattress is the right fit. Right now, Helix has a 4th of July sale going on, which also includes pillows, like their Comfort Adjust cooling pillow, which allows you to add or subtract filling so it's the perfect height. And I'm told that pillow stays cool all night, baby. So if you guys want to try Helix, go to helixsleep.com/Lagerstrom to get 20% off site-wide while this sale is going on. Again, that's helixsleep.com/Lagerstrom for 20% off site-wide. Thank you, Helix. And after 3 hours at 250, I'm gonna pull out the Dutch oven, pop the lid, and take a little look. Woo, that smells porky as hell. You can also see that after that halfway point, this pork has rendered out a bunch more fat and a bunch more of its porky juices. And now it's cooking in that hybrid style where the bottom is getting the braise and the top is getting that confit. And it doesn't really matter which part is sitting in the fat or sitting in the moisture, as long as the meat itself is cooking submerged in something wet at about 250 F. That's what makes it super unctuous and super tender. Speaking of tenderness, I need to pull out a chunk of this pork and actually test it for doneness. To do that, I'm just gonna stick a couple of forks in the meat and give it a tug. As you can see, if I wanted to, I could shred this meat pretty easily, just with a little bit of extra effort, but it's not totally falling apart. For me, that is the sweet spot. A lot of people, I think, would cook it all the way in the Dutch oven to the point where it's super shreddable, but you gotta keep in mind, this meat is going to continue to cook as it sits in the liquid, and that's actually something that we want to happen. That's how it kind of finishes slowly and gently, and that's how we get the best result. But if it's already pull apart at this point, you've got nowhere to go, and then the meat is gonna be totally fall apart, and it's gonna be pretty dry. Also, I wanna talk about cook time here. I'd say 3 hours in the recipe, and the 5 or 6 times I've cooked this, it's been almost exactly 3 hours, but your oven, your pot, your pork is gonna be different. So you need to use your senses instead of the clock, and you wanna cook the pork until it reaches this point where you could shred it if you put some effort into it, but it's not gonna fall apart. So I'm gonna scoot this pork back over into the pork fat and pork juice. I'll agitate everything a little bit here just to make sure that anything that was dry and sticking up during that last phase is getting a bit more moisture on it. So from here, I'm gonna pop a lid back on the Dutch oven. Then I'm just gonna let this chill out and relax for about an hour or so. At first, the pork is going to carry over cook because it's still pretty hot in here. And that's gonna bring it right into that textural sweet spot where it is perfectly unctuously tender. Also, during this time period, the pork muscle fibers are gonna relax and then soak up a bunch of the cooking liquid. So not only is it gonna get more texturally satisfying, it's gonna get a lot more moist. We're gonna let this chill. We'll check back in an hour. All right, after about an hour of resting, when I come back, the Dutch oven has cooled down quite a bit. At this point, it's probably like warm cup of coffee temperature. And that just tells me that the meat has finished resting and has finished its cooking process. So when I come back to see just how shreddy it is, you can see like I could completely shred this now. It's super unctuous. It's just bathed in its own pork fat and it looks just nasty. So from here, I'm gonna pop a lid on my Dutch oven, then I'm gonna throw it in the fridge to cool down and set up for at least 4 hours, but preferably overnight. Now, I know a lot of people are gonna be pretty bummed about this addition of time to the recipe. So if you're in a rush and you want a same-day carnitas experience, you certainly can go ahead and start turning these into tacos right away. You just have to know that you're gonna be losing a little bit of quality because freshly cooked meat is just going to lose more moisture and shred more in the pan, and you'll have a drier, slightly less good result. Now, I like to keep it in the fridge just because as it sits in there, the flavors integrate more, so everything tastes better. It sucks up more of that roasty pork juice, so it's moister, and then like texturally, it just gives you a better result because we melted all of that collagen into gelatin very gently and very slowly, and then when you let that set in the fridge, you get this texture that's very gelatinous, succulent, and soft, but the meat is held together. It like still has structural integrity so that when you go to sear it, it actually stays together. So that's my truth. If you want to do it same day, pick up the video a little bit later in the process. We'll see you tomorrow. The next day, when I pull this out of the fridge, you can see that we've got a pot full of cold pork and solid fat. So from here, we got to do some work to kind of bring all of this together. So I'm going to set up 2 bowls, one for my pork gold, which I'll explain what that is in a second, and one for my pork fat. And then I'm also gonna grab a bowl to put the chunks of pork as I pull them out of the Dutch oven. So first, I'm just gonna come back and kind of fish those out and set them off to the side here. And if you come across one of those roasty, mushy oranges, just throw that out. Okay, once I got a bowl full of pork, I'm gonna set that aside. Then I'm gonna separate the fat that we rendered out of the pork from the gold. Now, if you're wondering what pork gold is, it's basically this gelatinous pork drip that's settled at the bottom of the pot here. This is basically extremely flavorful pork essence that is squeezed out during the slow cooking process, and it's really flavorful. It's basically just concentrated pork that's full of gelatin and roasty pork flavor. And in restaurants, this stuff is highly sought after. Whenever you're making a confit or a slow roast, a lot of times we'll use pork gold or duck gold to finish off a dish to bring a little bit of extra something. It's not quite like demi-glace, but it's not. It just kind of brings a hyper porkiness to a dish, and it's really worth saving. And I think that a lot of carnitas recipes, especially Mexican restaurant carnitas, miss out on this important detail. So I'm just gonna kind of harvest this gold by pouring it into a bowl. This is quite a bit more than we need, but it's pretty flavorful. You could use this in future braises, or you could fortify soups with it. It's essentially just really flavorful pork stock. Next, I'm just gonna jump into the bowl and start shredding down my pork. I want some mix of chunks and some bits to be kind of thready and more broken down. I like this heterogeneous texture because for me, the thin, thready stuff is the stuff that ends up crisping up the most, and that's really what you want in a carnita. But you also want pork chunks because those are holding on to a lot of meat juice, and when you combine those two together, you're getting optimal texture and moisture and flavor. I just think it gets thrown out of balance when it's all thready stuff or all chunky stuff. And at some point, you'll come across just a piece of straight up pork fat that has no meat on it. That's already given its gift of rendered fat and allowed us to kind of confit the meat, but at this point, it's not gonna be delicious at all, so just 86 that. And if you're wondering why I'm shredding this the next day as opposed to doing it same day, well, not only does letting this rest in the fridge overnight make the meat taste a lot better because it's allowed the flavors of the pork to kind of integrate, just like any proper braise. If you give it time overnight, it's just gonna get more flavorful as things cool down, but also it's gonna give the meat a better structure. It's something that if I can do it, I almost always will. Certainly you could do it same day and it would be totally fine. You're just gonna be losing out on a little bit of quality. And honestly, when I'm cooking dishes like this, it's usually a party food, so I prefer to prepare as much of it in advance as possible. So that way, when it's the day of, all I really have to do is worry about assembling. This way you can just grab it out of the fridge 30 minutes before you wanna eat and you're gonna be ready to go. Okay, once I've got this pork shredded down into a mix of chunk and smaller thready bits, it's time to move on. Now earlier when I said that this is going to require a little bit of finesse and attention from you guys, this is what I was talking about. The recipe calls for 150 grams of additional pork fat and 150 grams of gold, but when we were pulling the pork out of the Dutch oven earlier, a lot of pork fat came along with it, so I'm just using my judgment at this point. I don't think it needs any more. There's probably about 100 to 150 grams in there already. So we're just gonna add in the pork gold. So I'm gonna take my bowl of reserved gold and measure in, let's call it 150 grams. That's what the recipe calls for. And then I'm gonna mix it in so that we've got a good, like a 50-50 ratio of pork gold and pork fat spread all over the carnitas. This is kind of a signature move that I came up with that I think by far gives you the best carnitas result at home. Every little bit of pork here is coated in both rendered pork fat and super flavorful, well-seasoned, gelatinous pork juice, so that when you put this in the pan, that pork fat instantly melts and it starts sizzling up the pork, crisping it up, but also at the same time that pork gold is melting, which is creating steam, which is keeping the pork moist, and then eventually it kind of reduces into like this meaty lacquer on the outside. So you get the best of both worlds. You get a crispy result that's really unctuous and quite fatty, and then you also get something that's super flavorful and really, really meaty. During this last phase of the mix too, I'm also just gonna be a little bit more aggressive to get a bit more of that shred going on. And you can just tell by looking at this that this is going to be divine when cooked over high heat. You don't always have to bust the scale out to get the exact amount. I put it in there to give you something prescriptive so that you could have the same result as me, but certainly eyeball it. If it's looking like really wet, don't add a ton of pork gold. Or if it's clear that there's pork fat smeared all over the whole thing, don't make it too greasy. Just use your brain and your gut in combination to get you towards something that you feel like is gonna work. Okay, once it's taco time, I'm gonna preheat a large nonstick pan over medium-high heat, and I'm also gonna make sure that all of my taco stuff is ready to go. That means I've got a full mag of fresh and floppy flour tortillas. Yes, I'm using flour over corn, for reasons I'll explain later. I've got a pint of spicy salsa here, and then I've also got some cilantro and onion. I think it's important to have all that stuff ready just because once the pork is crisped up, you wanna serve it right away. The longer it sits this in the pan, the drier it gets. And like really juicy, crispy carnitas exist in a very specific, fleeting moment of time. And you really wanna make sure you're getting them into people's mouths as quickly as possible. You can see there's a little bit of wispiness in the pan here. That means it's nice and hot. So from here, I'm gonna add in, let's say like 4 tacos worth. In a pan this large, you could easily crisp up 10 to 12, but I wanna illustrate the process really cleanly and clearly for you guys, so I'm not gonna overcrowd the pan. And I'm not gonna add any additional fat to the pan just because there is quite a bit of pork fat mixed in with this pork already. And once it's in the pan, I'm just gonna come back with a spatula and kind of press it into the pan just to make sure that as much of the pork is touching the surface as possible. So from here, I'm just gonna let this sit for about 90 seconds or so to allow it to get nice and crispy. I would avoid constant stirring because that's not only gonna break the pork down further and make it much more threadier, you're not ever really gonna establish a crispy layer. It takes a decent amount of time in contact with a hot pan for that to happen. Now, I also just want to explain at this point, a lot of Mexican restaurants, or let's say if you're going to like a Mexican party outside where they're serving carnitas, they're probably gonna be deep frying this in a lot of lard in larger chunks. And that can lead to a pretty good result, but it's pretty hard to control, especially at home. You can see why frying in lard to finish wouldn't be a particularly practical process. And honestly, I don't think it gives you the best product, period. It might be a good way to do it for a crowd, but at home, you're just not gonna get that much crispiness. And you're really gonna dry out your pork if you don't know what you're doing. As you can see, I got a little bit flipped over here, super brown, super crispy, and it's just sizzling up perfectly. The lard or the rendered pork fat is melting, and then the pork gold is kind of keeping things moist and steamy. That helps warm up the pork while also reducing and making it have that concentrated salty pork flavor from the gold. Once I've got some crispiness like this, I'm gonna flip it over and try and get a little bit more in contact with the pan, press it down one more time, and then I'll give it another 90 seconds or so. You just wanna cook it long enough for the pork to get warmed through and to get, let's say 30 to 40% of it nice and golden brown. Any more than that and the pork's gonna be dry. If you don't have a large nonstick pan, or if you're cooking carnitas for a big crowd and you don't wanna make only 8 to 10 tacos at a time, you could lay all of this dressed pork mixture out onto a sheet tray and throw it under the broiler. A big caveat there though, is that it's gonna be kind of hard to control, and since there's moisture and fat, things could get a little bit crackly. So you just gotta keep your eye on it and you gotta be a little bit careful. If what I'm doing here gives us a 10 out of 10, doing it under the broiler could give us like a 8.5. It's really not bad. It's just a little bit hard to control and a little bit messy. And there we go, dude. You can see we've got the perfect blend of moist, large chunks of pork, and then we've got all this thready stuff that's been fried to a crisp. This is going to be texturally extremely satisfying, to say the least. And it smells super, super good. One last thing that's totally optional here is to just add like a little tiny splash of pork gold at the end. That's gonna reduce down and steam this one last time and just make it a little bit more juicy on the final taco. Woo, man. You can really smell a little bit of orange and cinnamon coming through. Okay, let's put it on a tortilla. Okay, to get started, I'm gonna drop a couple of floppy, hot flour tortillas. And if you're really mad about that and you think it should be corn, I totally understand. I just wanna clarify that this is not a 100% authentic Mexican recipe by any means. This is my ode to carnitas, and I'm just showing you guys how to have a great experience. And I think that the soft sweetness of a flour tortilla makes for a really, really beautiful taco. And unless you can get a really high quality S-tier corn tortilla, I just think you're gonna have a better experience if you go with this. Look at that though. Juicy meat, crispy meat, mixed together. I'm so hyped. Okay, now I'm gonna put on a little bit of salsa. This is my salsa taquera recipe that we actually did last week in my salsa 3 ways video. It's essentially tomatillos, tomatoes, and a bunch of different types of dried chilies, and it's quite spicy. It's got some bright acidity, and it's super intense. It's one of my all-time favorite salsas, and I think that the high acidity pairs perfectly with the super rich pork here. Then I'm gonna put on some raw white onion that I very finely diced, and a little pro tip here, or like a little chefy tip, is that I rinse it under some cold water to get rid of the excessive sulfuriness so you don't have onion breath for the rest of the day, and then some just fresh cilantro. And look at that, dude. Man, who doesn't want this? I can just tell already that I'm gonna be very happy very soon. Let's give it a bite. The first texture you get, I'm very happy to report, is crispy, which is a very rare texture to have in a taco. And it's pretty challenging to pull that off while keeping the meat juicy. I've been testing this recipe for over 2 weeks, and the first like 5 or 6 batches were pretty dry. We got them crispy, but we weren't able to maintain juice. And adding that little bit of gold at the end, the way we cooked it, the way we cooled it overnight, it just all comes together to give you such a high quality textural experience. That's very rare. It's perfect with the flour tortilla. And then this salsa, oh my gosh. Check out that recipe, guys. It's really freaking good. It's spicy, it's very vibrant, it's smoky, it's intense, and it just pairs perfectly with what is a pretty, I wouldn't say neutral tasting pork, but it's not like exotic. You know, it really just tastes like, porkiness is the thing that comes to mind. When you get the really crispy bits, it almost tastes like crispy bacon, which is so sick. Especially when you pair it up with this very intense, very spicy, smoky salsa. Also, just feel free to roast me in the comments for the corn tortilla thing. I just think at home in this moment for this taco, the flour tortilla is 100% the right move. Just like a double layer of very hearty corn here, I think makes the taco like a little bit too heavy. This is very unctuous, very fatty. All carnitas are kind of like that. And when you combine all that corn with it, it just kind of will sit really heavy in your stomach. Instead, you get something that's really light and fluffy and sweet, and it just kind of wraps the taco. It's like the taco's friend. I don't know how to describe it. If you guys want to make this recipe, I will throw the short version down in the description beneath this video. Then I will also link to the long version with much more detail over at my blog at brianlagerstrom.com. As always, guys, thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video, and I'll see you next time.